Imagine being trapped in a forest with no way out, pursued by terrifying creatures and an ancient evil that seems to know your every thought. What happens when the one person you're trying to save becomes your only hope and your greatest fear? Stay tuned to witness the shocking twist that no one saw coming. The flashlight beam wavered as Detective James pushed deeper into the woods. The night air clung to his skin, damp and heavy. Every crunch of twigs beneath his boots sounded deafening in the eerie silence. He scanned the towering trees, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal arms toward the inky sky. A faint rustle whispered behind him. He froze. "Emily?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the dense shadows. No answer. Just the soft hum of the wind threading through the leaves. His partner, Officer Claire, trailed a few steps behind. "See anything?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Nothing yet." The missing girl's photo burned in his mind. Emily, his sister, with her bright smile. She'd vanished 3 days ago, leaving behind her purse and an open journal. The pages had been filled with frantic scrawls about someone watching her. Something. The search had led them here, to this desolate patch of forest. A place locals refused to enter after dark. The air grew colder the farther they walked. The trees seemed to tighten their grip around the path, blocking the moonlight. Claire cursed softly. Her flashlight flickered and went out. James handed her his spare, their fingers brushing briefly. "Stay close," he muttered. They pushed on, the oppressive quiet now broken by faint, rhythmic sounds. Drip, drip, drip. James stopped. The noise wasn't water. It was too thick, too wet. He moved the light toward the sound. The beam landed on a tree trunk. The bark glistened, streaked with something dark. Blood. Claire swore again, her breath hitching. "It's fresh," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound shifted. A low growl, deep and guttural, rumbled from the shadows ahead. Claire raised her flashlight, her trembling hand casting jerky light patterns against the trees. Something moved fast. Too fast. A blur of motion and a sickening thud. James spun, his flashlight catching a glimpse of Claire's horrified face before it was yanked into the darkness. Her scream echoed, sharp and short. "Claire." James bolted forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The growl grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath him. He stumbled into a clearing. The flashlight beams swept across the space, landing on a figure. Emily. She stood motionless, her back to him, her long hair matted with dirt. "Emily," he called, his voice shaking. She turned slowly. Her eyes weren't her own. They glowed an unnatural yellow, pupils slitted like a predator's. Blood dripped from her lips. "James," she said, her voice soft and cold. Something massive loomed behind her, its shadow stretching impossibly tall. The growl deepened, echoing in his chest. And then, the monster stepped into the light. Its form was grotesque, a nightmare pulled from the depths of hell. Skin blackened and cracked, oozing a thick, tar-like substance. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in claws that gleamed like polished bone. Eyes glowed the same sickly yellow as Emily's, hollow yet piercing. It stood still, its breath raspy and wet, filling the air with a putrid stench. James couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, every survival instinct drowned by sheer terror. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her head tilted, an eerie smile creeping across her face. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she asked, her tone laced with something inhuman. The words echoed, warped, as though spoken from somewhere deep within the earth. James gripped his flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. "I'm here now," he said, forcing strength into his trembling voice. He took a step forward, but the monster growled, its maw opening wide. Rows of jagged teeth gleamed, dripping with the same black sludge. The ground beneath James seemed to pulse, the air vibrating with an unnatural hum. Emily raised a hand, her fingers twitching unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. "Don't come closer," she warned, though her voice sounded like two, hers and something darker, guttural. James hesitated, his mind racing. Behind him, the forest seemed alive. The trees creaked and groaned as though shifting, closing in. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, dozens of shadowy shapes darting between the trees. He forced his attention back to Emily, his heart aching as much as it was terrified. "Emily, it's me. I can help you," he pleaded, his voice breaking. Her expression faltered for a moment, the smile slipping. But then her eyes glowed brighter, and she laughed, a sound so hollow and wrong it made his stomach churn. "You're too late," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. The monster behind her lurched forward, its claws sinking into the earth as it advanced. James stumbled back, his flashlight beam flickering wildly. The ground beneath him quaked, a deep rumble vibrating through his feet. From the darkness, a hand shot out. It wasn't Emily's. It was Claire's. Her fingers clawed at the ground, her face pale and bloodied as she crawled into the light. "Run," she choked, her voice raw and desperate. James hesitated, torn between helping her and reaching for Emily. But the monster lunged. Its roar split the air, a deafening, guttural sound that drowned out every thought. James barely had time to react before the darkness swallowed them all. James dove to the ground, narrowly avoiding the monster's massive claws. The air was thick with the scent of decay, choking him as he scrambled to his feet. "Claire," he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. She was barely moving, her body half buried in the dirt as though the forest itself was trying to claim her. The creature growled, its head snapping toward Claire like a predator fixating on wounded prey. James didn't think. He grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it with all his strength. It struck the monster's side with a sickening thud. The beast's head jerked toward him, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Over here, you bastard!" James yelled, his voice trembling but fierce. The creature roared, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to shift and multiply. It lunged toward him, its claws raking through the air. James ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he dodged between the trees. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if the forest was alive, shifting and writhing with each step. Behind him, the monster's heavy footsteps shook the earth. Its growls grew louder, closer, until James could feel its hot, rancid breath on the back of his neck. He stumbled into another clearing, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The moonlight illuminated the scene before him. A circle of stones, ancient and weathered, stood in the center of the clearing. Symbols were etched into their surfaces, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Emily stood in the middle of the circle, her expression unreadable. "James," she said, her voice softer now, almost human. He stepped toward her, his heart pounding. "What is this? What's happening to you?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood on her skin. "You can't save me," she whispered. The monster burst into the clearing, its massive frame barely fitting between the trees. It stopped at the edge of the circle, snarling but unable to cross the glowing stones. Emily turned to James, her eyes pleading. "Leave. Before it takes you too." "No," he shouted, stepping closer. "I'm not leaving without you." The ground beneath them shook violently, cracks spidering outward from the circle of stones. The symbols flared brighter, casting the clearing in an eerie, pulsating light. Emily screamed, her voice blending with the guttural roar of the monster. James reached for her, but the light erupted, blinding and searing, as the earth beneath them split open. Something ancient, something far more terrifying than the monster, began to rise. The ground crumbled beneath James, forcing him to stagger backward. A deafening roar erupted from the chasm, louder than the creatures, an ancient, guttural sound that seemed to pierce his very soul. The light from the stones turned blood-red, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. From the widening fissure, a massive, shadowy form began to emerge. It was impossible to fully comprehend. A writhing mass of limbs, mouths, and eyes, each blinking in chaotic unison. James stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The thing defied reality, its presence warping the air around it. Emily stood at the center of the chaos, her arms stretched outward as if she were tethering the beast. Her body trembled, her voice strained. "You shouldn't have come, James," she said, her tone now layered with echoes of countless other voices. Tears blurred his vision. "I won't leave you," he yelled over the howling wind that had erupted from the chasm. The monster outside the circle roared in defiance, clawing at the ground as if trying to force its way through the barrier. But it wasn't attacking Emily anymore. It was retreating, cowering. James realized, with a sickening jolt, that the monster wasn't the apex predator here. It had been serving something far worse. The ancient entity towering over the clearing seemed to notice him now. A dozen eyes turned in unison, locking onto him. James felt his knees buckle under the weight of its gaze. It wasn't just looking at him, it was inside him, peeling back every memory, every fear, every hidden thought. He screamed, clutching his head as pain lanced through his skull. Emily's voice broke through the agony, weak but urgent. "Run, James. There's nothing you can do." He looked up, his vision swimming. Her face was pale, her body trembling as the thing's tendrils coiled around her. But her eyes, those glowing, inhuman eyes, held a flicker of something familiar. Something human. "I can save you," he shouted, taking a step toward the circle. "No," she screamed, the desperation in her voice stopping him cold. Her body arched backward as the tendrils tightened, pulling her closer to the writhing mass. "If you stay, it'll take you too." The chasm widened further, the earth beneath James' feet cracking and splintering. The light pulsed faster, each flash accompanied by a deep, guttural thrum that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. The beast, the ancient thing, began to shift, its form expanding, consuming the air itself. James felt himself being pulled toward it, as if gravity had bent to its will. His heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run. But his feet wouldn't move. Emily looked at him one last time, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, with a deafening roar, the tendrils yanked her into the abyss. The light erupted, blinding and scorching. James fell to the ground, his screams drowned out by the overwhelming noise and fury. And then, silence. When he opened his eyes, the clearing was empty. The stones were gone. The fissure was sealed. And the forest stood eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. James lay motionless on the cold, uneven ground, his body trembling as the stillness of the forest pressed in around him. The air was heavy, suffocating, yet eerily silent, too silent. No chirping crickets. No rustling leaves. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned the place. His head pounded, and his vision blurred as he forced himself to sit up. The clearing looked untouched, almost serene, as if the chaos that had unfolded moments ago had been erased. But he could still feel it. The weight of something ancient and malevolent lingered, pressing against his chest like an invisible hand. "Emily," he croaked, his voice raw and hollow. There was no answer. No sign of her. No sign of the monster or the unfathomable entity that had emerged from the abyss. All that remained was a faint scorch mark on the ground where the circle of stones had been. His hands shook as he fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. He scanned the clearing, desperate for any trace of her, any proof she hadn't been swallowed whole by the void. But there was nothing. Not even Claire. A wave of nausea washed over him as he stumbled to his feet. He called out again, louder this time. Claire. Emily. The echo of his own voice was the only response. The forest loomed around him, its gnarled branches reaching like claws, casting shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. His breaths came in shallow gasps, each one louder in the suffocating silence. And then,
a sound. Faint.
A low, wet gurgle coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. James froze, his body stiffening as the noise grew louder. He turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand as he aimed it toward the source. The beam landed on something sprawled among the roots of a massive tree.
Claire.
Her body was twisted unnaturally, her uniform torn and stained with blood. But she was alive, barely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and her lips moved as if trying to form words. Claire. James ran to her, dropping to his knees beside her broken form. She coughed, a spray of blood flecking her chin as her eyes fluttered open. Her gaze locked onto his, wide and filled with terror. James, she rasped, her voice barely audible. Don't move, he said, his hands hovering over her, unsure where to touch without causing more harm. I'll get help. But she shook her head weakly, her hand gripping his wrist with surprising strength. No time. Her eyes darted toward the trees, panic flooding her expression. It's still here. James felt his blood run cold. What's still here? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Claire's gaze flickered to the darkness beyond the clearing, and her lips quivered as she tried to speak. But before she could answer, a low growl rumbled from the shadows. James whipped his head around, the flashlight beam slicing through the trees. The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground. And then he saw them.
Eyes.
Dozens of them, glowing yellow and unblinking, watching from the darkness. They moved closer, slowly, deliberately, circling the clearing like wolves closing in on their prey. James grabbed Claire's hand, his heart hammering in his chest. We need to move, he whispered, his voice trembling. But she didn't respond. Her grip on his wrist went slack. He turned back to her, his stomach dropping as he realized she was staring blankly at the sky. Her chest no longer moved. No, James whispered, shaking her gently. No. The growling grew louder, the eyes drawing closer. James stood, his flashlight shaking as he aimed it at the advancing shadows. Stay back, he shouted, his voice cracking. But the creatures didn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. And then, from the darkness, a familiar voice echoed. James. He froze. It was Emily's voice. Soft, melodic, and calling to him from deep within the trees. James, come find me. Tears streamed down his face as he turned toward the sound. He knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But still, he stepped toward it, drawn by the faint glimmer of hope. The growling ceased, the forest falling into an oppressive silence once more. And then, the eyes disappeared. One by one, they blinked out, leaving James alone in the suffocating darkness. But the voice remained. James, I'm waiting. And he took another step into the shadows. James stumbled forward, his legs feeling heavier with every step. The voice calling his name seemed to echo from every direction, weaving through the trees like an unseen thread pulling him deeper into the forest. Emily, he whispered, his throat dry and raw. The flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker, casting faint and jagged shadows that danced across the gnarled roots and tangled undergrowth. The ground was soft beneath his boots, damp and spongy, as though the earth itself was rotting. The stench of decay grew stronger, filling his nostrils and turning his stomach. James, the voice sang again, closer now. It was sweet, almost soothing, but there was something wrong, something hollow in the way it lingered in the air. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, his fingers slick with sweat. The beam wavered as he pressed on, the trees closing in around him, their bark appearing twisted and claw-like. The forest seemed alive, breathing, shifting. Branches reached out, snagging his sleeves and dragging against his skin, as if trying to hold him back. But he kept moving. He couldn't stop. Ahead, the trees parted, revealing another clearing bathed in an eerie, bluish glow. In the center stood Emily. Her back was to him, her long hair swaying gently as if caught in an invisible breeze. She was motionless, her bare feet sinking slightly into the dark, sodden ground. "Emily," James called, his voice breaking. She turned slowly, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. Her face was pale, her skin almost translucent under the strange light. Her eyes were still glowing, bright and inhuman, the yellow hue cutting through the shadows like twin lanterns. "You came," she said softly, her lips curling into a faint smile. James felt a lump rise in his throat. "I couldn't leave you," he said, stepping closer. Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Why, James?" she asked, her voice layered with sadness and something darker. "Why didn't you stay away?" He stopped, confusion and fear knotting in his chest. "What do you mean?" Her gaze shifted, no longer looking at him but past him, into the forest behind him. "You shouldn't have followed me here," she whispered. A cold gust of wind rushed through the clearing, carrying with it the sound of low, guttural growls. James spun around, the flashlight beam flickering wildly. The forest was alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees, shapes too fast and too fluid to be fully seen. The growls grew louder, merging into a cacophony of snarls and howls. He turned back to Emily, panic rising in his chest. "Emily, we have to go."
Now.
She shook her head slowly, her smile fading. "It's too late," she said, her voice flat, almost mechanical. The ground beneath her feet began to crack, black tendrils of smoke seeping upward and coiling around her legs. James rushed forward, his hand outstretched. But as he reached her, something cold and solid clamped around his wrist. He looked down and saw a blackened hand, bony, clawed, and dripping with the same tar-like substance as the creature from before. It wasn't Emily holding him. It was something else. He yanked his arm back, but the grip tightened, pulling him closer to the fissure that had opened beneath her. Emily's form began to change, her features distorting, her body elongating into something monstrous. Her voice, now deep and guttural, echoed in his ears. "You shouldn't have come, James." The fissure widened, and from its depths came a sound, a deafening, otherworldly scream that shook the very ground beneath him. James screamed too, his flashlight clattering to the ground as the darkness consumed him. James's scream was swallowed by the abyss as the ground beneath him gave way. The cold, clawed hand yanked him downward with unnatural strength, dragging him into the black void. His body tumbled into weightlessness, the air around him thick and suffocating like drowning in tar. There was no light, no sense of up or down, only the feeling of being pulled deeper and deeper. He clawed at the nothingness, his fingers grasping for something solid, but it was futile. The darkness wasn't just around him, it was inside him, pressing into his chest, whispering in his ears. Faint, haunting voices swirled in the void, overlapping in a dissonant symphony. "Why did you come? You don't belong here. Stay forever." James clenched his jaw, shaking his head as he tried to block them out. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams, the voices overlapping until they became unbearable. His head throbbed, his vision swimming even though there was nothing to see. Suddenly, a dim, flickering light appeared below him, red and pulsating, like the dying embers of a fire. He was falling faster now, hurtling toward it. As he neared the source of the light, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Twisted figures with gaunt faces and hollow eyes reached out toward him, their mouths open in silent wails. Their fingers brushed against his skin, icy cold and slimy, leaving trails of burning pain wherever they touched. James screamed again, kicking and thrashing, desperate to escape their grasp. The red light grew brighter, revealing a massive, churning pit of molten black sludge. The shapes writhed within it, clawing at its edges, trying to pull themselves free, only to sink back into the bubbling mass. Above it all, towering and formless, was the ancient entity he'd seen before, the massive eyes, limbs, and mouths. Its gaze turned toward him, and he felt his body freeze midair. Every nerve in his body screamed in agony as the thing's many mouths opened, speaking in a voice that wasn't sound but pure, overwhelming thought. You
Do
not belong here. The force of the words drove into his mind like a hammer, shattering his thoughts, leaving only raw fear. The creature reached out with tendrils of darkness, wrapping around him, pulling him closer to the churning pit. Emily, he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. The name echoed back to him, warped and twisted, as if the void itself was mocking him. And then, from the edge of the pit, a faint figure appeared. It was Emily, or what was left of her. Her body was pale and thin, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes glowed faintly, but the light within them was dimmer, weaker. She reached out a trembling hand toward James, her lips moving silently. James strained to hear her, the creature's tendrils tightening around him. "Help me," she whispered, her voice fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. The ancient entity roared, its form shifting violently as its tendrils coiled tighter. The pit below bubbled and hissed, its surface rising to consume them both. James clenched his fists, his body trembling with fear and desperation. With one final surge of strength, he reached for Emily, their fingers brushing just as the darkness surged around them. The void exploded with light, blinding, searing, and filled with a deafening, otherworldly sound that drowned out everything. And then silence. James gasped, his body collapsing onto solid ground. The cold air stung his skin as he opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light of dawn breaking through the trees. He was back in the forest. The clearing was gone. The stones, the fissure, the monster, everything was gone. But beside him, lying motionless on the damp earth, was Emily. Her chest rose and fell weakly, her skin pale but alive. "Emily," James whispered, crawling to her side. Her eyes fluttered open, the glow completely gone, replaced by a dull, human brown. "James," she murmured, her voice barely audible. He pulled her into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "I've got you," he said, his voice shaking. "I've got you." But deep within the forest, hidden in the shadows, something watched. Its glowing yellow eyes blinked once before fading into the darkness. James sat with Emily cradled in his arms, his breath shallow and uneven. The early morning light filtered through the canopy, soft and pale, but the air still felt wrong, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Emily stirred weakly, her fingers twitching against his chest. "James," she whispered again, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the stillness. "I'm here," he said, brushing the damp hair from her face. "You're safe now. I've got you." Her eyes fluttered open, dull and glassy, but they found his. Her lips moved, but the words didn't come out right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a strained rasp. "You shouldn't have." James froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Her gaze shifted past him, her expression a mix of fear and sorrow. "It's not over." The words sent a chill racing down his spine. James turned his head slowly, following her line of sight. The forest had grown darker, the light of dawn dimming unnaturally. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, swirling and twisting like living things. And then he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Not growling, not howling, something worse. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too many of them. They echoed through the forest, growing louder, closer. James scrambled to his feet, pulling Emily up with him. She could barely stand, her legs weak and unsteady, but he wrapped her arm around his shoulder, holding her upright. "We need to move," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. She nodded weakly, her head resting against him as he half-carried, half-dragged her toward the nearest gap in the trees. The footsteps followed, multiplying, the sound filling the air like a swarm closing in. James didn't dare look back. He focused on the uneven ground ahead, weaving through the dense undergrowth, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Emily groaned softly, her weight growing heavier with every step. "Just hold on," he urged, his own legs burning with exhaustion. The sound of the footsteps shifted, spreading out, surrounding them. Branches snapped to their left. Leaves rustled to their right. And then, ahead of them, something emerged. James skidded to a halt, his stomach dropping. It wasn't human. It stood hunched, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its body covered in patches of matted fur and glistening, oozing flesh. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a void, a black, swirling mass where eyes and a mouth should have been. Behind it, more shapes appeared, stepping out of the shadows one by one. They were all different, grotesque and malformed, like nightmares given form. James tightened his grip on Emily, his mind racing. He looked around frantically, searching for a way out. But they were surrounded. The creatures moved closer, their heads tilting unnaturally as they studied him, studied Emily. A low, guttural sound rippled through the group, almost like a laugh. James backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. "Stay back," he said, his voice cracking. One of the creatures stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. It raised a long, clawed hand, pointing directly at Emily. She whimpered softly, clutching at James as her knees buckled. "They want me," she murmured, her voice trembling. James shook his head, his grip on her tightening.
"No," he said.
Firmly. "I won't let them take you." The creature tilted its head, the swirling void of its face seeming to ripple in response. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound, a deep, resonant vibration that filled James's skull, making his vision blur. He staggered, nearly dropping Emily as the sound grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't a voice. It was a command. "Give her to us." James gritted his teeth, fighting against the pressure in his head. "No," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "You can't have hers." The creatures stopped, their heads tilting in unison. And then, as if bound by some unseen force, they began to close in. James felt the ground tremble beneath their weight, the air growing colder with every step. Emily's fingers clutched at his shirt, her voice a faint whisper. "James, run." But he couldn't. He wouldn't. As the first creature lunged, he braced himself, determined to fight until the very end. The first creature launched forward, its claws slicing through the air with unnatural speed. James twisted his body, pulling Emily away just in time. The creature's claws grazed his shoulder, tearing his jacket and leaving a shallow cut that burned like fire. He stumbled back, nearly dropping Emily, but he gritted his teeth and steadied himself. The others closed in, their movements jerky and chaotic, their twisted forms flickering in and out of the shadows like phantoms. James swung his flashlight wildly, its beam weak, but enough to make the creatures recoil for a split second. He took the chance and ran, dragging Emily with him, her feet barely touching the ground. "Hold on," he shouted, though his voice cracked under the weight of his fear. The forest blurred around him, trees whipping past as he barreled through the undergrowth. Branches clawed at his face and arms, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the sound of the creature's pursuit was deafening. Snarls, heavy footfalls, and the horrible scraping of claws against bark. Emily's breathing was ragged, her weight growing heavier with each step. "James, I can't," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "You can," he snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. "Just a little farther." But even as he said it, he knew they couldn't outrun them. The creatures were too fast, too relentless. A guttural roar erupted behind him, followed by a rush of wind. James turned just in time to see one of the creatures leaping toward them, its gaping maw filled with jagged, blackened teeth. Instinct took over. He pivoted, dropping Emily to the ground and throwing himself in front of her. The creature slammed into him, its weight knocking the air from his lungs as they crashed to the ground. Its claws raked across his chest, drawing blood, and its void-like face hovered inches from his own. James screamed, shoving against its chest with all his strength, but it was like trying to move a mountain. The creature growled, its foul breath washing over him, and James felt his strength fading. Then, a flash of light. Bright and blinding, it erupted from behind him, bathing the forest in an otherworldly glow. The creature howled, recoiling as the light burned into its form, its body writhing and flickering as though being torn apart. James rolled to the side, gasping for air, and turned to see the source of the light. Emily. She was on her knees, her hands outstretched, her eyes glowing once more. But this time, they weren't the sickly yellow of before. They were brilliant white, pulsing with a pure, radiant energy that seemed to push back the darkness itself. The creatures shrieked, their forms disintegrating as the light consumed them, leaving nothing but wisps of black smoke. The forest fell silent again, the oppressive air lifting as the last of the creatures vanished. Emily collapsed, the light in her eyes fading as she slumped to the ground. James crawled to her side, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as he gently cradled her. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. What just happened?" Her eyes fluttered open, her gaze distant and unfocused. "They wanted me," she murmured.
"But
"I fought them." James nodded, his throat tight as he held her closer. "It's over," he said, though the words felt hollow. "You're safe now." But deep down, he knew it wasn't the truth. The forest still felt alive, still watched them. And far in the distance, hidden in the shadows, faint yellow eyes blinked once, then disappeared into the black. James sat with Emily in his arms, his heartbeat slowing, but his mind racing. The silence of the forest wasn't comforting. It was wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of the creatures returning, but all he heard was the faint rustling of leaves in the cold breeze. Emily's breathing was shallow, her body limp, her face pale. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. "We have to get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaky. He hoisted her onto his back, gritting his teeth against the weight and the pain in his chest. Every breath sent sharp stabs of fire through the scratches left by the creature's claws. But he pushed forward, his legs trembling, his eyes scanning the trees for a way out. The path ahead was barely visible, the faint light of dawn doing little to pierce the forest's lingering gloom. James stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the damp, uneven ground. The trees around him seemed to shift, their twisted branches creaking as though whispering to one another. "Just keep moving," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. His voice felt small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. A soft sound stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the growls or footsteps of before. It was humming. Faint, melodic, and eerily familiar. James turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead, drifting through the trees like a ghostly lullaby. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer. The humming grew louder, wrapping around him like a cold wind, tugging at the edges of his sanity. Emily stirred on his back, her fingers twitching against his shoulder. "James," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Her head lifted weakly, her lips parting as she whispered a single word. "Run." Before he could react, the forest erupted around them. The ground beneath his feet cracked, dark fissures snaking outward like veins. From the shadows, the creatures returned, their twisted forms materializing out of the gloom. But they weren't alone this time. Something larger, something far worse, loomed behind them. It was the same ancient, shapeless entity he'd seen before in the clearing. Its massive eyes, mouths, and limbs writhed and shifted, a towering presence that seemed to devour the light itself. James froze, his legs refusing to move as the air grew heavy with its presence. The creature's many mouths opened, and a sound emerged, not a roar, but a low, guttural vibration that shook the very ground. It wasn't just sound. It was inside his head, piercing his thoughts, filling him with raw, paralyzing dread. Emily's voice broke through the noise, weak but urgent. "Go, James. Leave me." "No," he shouted, his grip on her tightening. "I'm not leaving you." The entity moved closer, its massive form bending the space around it, the forest warping and twisting in its wake. James forced his legs to move, running as fast as he could, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. The creatures pursued, their snarls and screeches blending into the chaotic hum of the ancient being. Branches clawed at his face, roots threatened to trip him, but he pushed on, adrenaline surging through his veins. Ahead, a faint light broke through the trees, a clearing, a way out. Almost there, he panted, his voice ragged. The ground shook violently, the entity's roar splitting the air as the fissures widened, black tendrils snaking toward him. He leapt over a gaping crack, the edges crumbling beneath his boots. The light grew brighter, blinding, as he reached the edge of the forest. With one final burst of strength, he hurled himself and Emily into the clearing. They tumbled to the ground, the cold grass beneath them a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness they'd escaped. James looked back, his chest heaving, his vision swimming. The forest stood still, its edge marked by a wall of impenetrable shadow. The creatures didn't follow, but the yellow eyes were still there, watching from the darkness. And the humming didn't stop. The ground cracked wider beneath them, the fissures snaking through the earth like veins, pulsing with dark energy. James's chest tightened, a flood of panic rising in his throat. Emily's head rested weakly against his shoulder, her breath shallow, her eyes flickering with fading consciousness. "We have to go," he whispered, but his voice was hollow, defeated. The humming, no longer just a sound but an oppressive force, seeped into his very being, weighing him down. The shadows around them seemed to close in, the trees twisting and writhing as though alive, their branches clawing toward the sky. James's body shook with the effort to move, but the air was thick, suffocating, and each step felt like a battle. The entity's voice filled the air again, a low, booming resonance that shuddered through his bones. "You are mine. Forever." James staggered to his feet, his eyes wide with terror, but Emily's grip on him tightened, her fragile fingers cold against his skin. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stop fighting." James looked down at her, his heart breaking at the look of resignation in her eyes. "No," he said firmly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't enough. The creatures were closing in, their distorted forms shifting and stretching in the darkness, their eyes burning with malevolent hunger. Emily's eyes closed slowly, her body going limp in his arms. "Emily?" James called desperately, shaking her gently. But there was no response. The air thickened, and the creature's steps became more pronounced, louder, like an army marching in sync. James could feel the weight of their gaze on him, could feel the ancient presence wrapping around his mind, drowning him in despair. With one final surge of strength, he knelt by Emily, his hand cupping her face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I couldn't save you." The light around them began to dim, the last vestiges of daylight fading into an endless twilight. And then there was nothing. The darkness swallowed them whole, consuming everything, leaving no trace of the forest, of the creatures, of their struggle. Only silence remained, cold, empty, and eternal. But even in that silence, the faintest echo of a voice lingered. "You were always mine,"